Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something really fundamental, how we make decisions, especially when things aren't crystal clear, when risk and uncertainty are involved.
Right. And you pointed us towards some really fascinating research, particularly the work behind prospect theory, which, well, it really shook things up in economics.
It did. We're drawing a lot from thinking fast and slow here. The goal is to unpack this theory, understand why our choices aren't always, shall we say, rational in the traditional sense.
Exactly. We're aiming to pull out the key insights for you, the listener, things that might surprise you. But without getting bogged down in dense academic stuff, it's about understanding those psychological drivers behind our choices.
Okay, so prospect theory, it didn't just appear overnight, did it?
No, not at all. It was, I think, a 5-year journey for Kahneman and Tversky, really digging into how people choose between gambles, between risky options.
And it was modeled on order ideas, like utility theory, but with a twist.
A big twist. Unlike utility theory, which can be prescriptive, telling you how you should choose, prospect theory was purely descriptive. It just aimed to document and explain the systematic ways we violate those rational axioms, the predictable errors in our thinking, if you like.
Interesting. And they chose to publish it in an economics journal, Econometrica. Why there, not a psychology journal?
Well, it was a strategic move. They wanted to engage with the core thinkers on decision theory, who were mostly economists at the time. It wasn't necessarily about converting economists initially, but it definitely got their attention and eventually had a huge impact on the field.
So where did they get the inspiration for this different approach?
A lot came from psychophysics, actually. The study of how we perceive physical quantities. Think Gustav Fechner back in the 19th century.
Psychophysics, how does that relate to money and choices?
Fechner found, basically, that our subjective experience doesn't scale linearly with physical reality. Like, the difference between a 10-watt bulb and a 20-watt bulb feels bigger than the difference between a 110-watt and a 120-watt bulb. It's often logarithmic.
Ah, okay, so a given percentage increase feels psychologically similar.
Exactly. And centuries before Kahneman and Tversky, Daniel Bernoulli had a similar idea about wealth. He proposed that the utility, or the psychological value, of wealth follows a similar logarithmic curve.
Meaning an extra $1,000 means a lot more to someone with, say, 10,000 than to someone with 1 million.
Precisely. That's why we often think in percentages about salary raises, for instance. A 5% raise feels somewhat comparable psychologically, regardless of the absolute starting amount.
And Bernoulli used this insight to look at gambles differently.
He did. He moved beyond just calculating the expected value probability times payoff to thinking about expected utility. How much psychological satisfaction does that potential outcome give you, considering your current wealth?
And that explained risk aversion, why we often prefer the sure thing.
Yes. Because of the diminishing marginal utility of wealth, that first million might drastically increase your well-being, but the 10th million, less so. So a gamble for a huge sum might have a high expected value, but the potential loss relative to your current state feels more impactful than the potential massive gain.
Which also explains things like insurance, right?
Hmm.
Someone poorer might buy it because losing that insured amount would be devastating to their overall well-being.
While someone wealthier might sell insurance because they can easily absorb that same loss. The utility calculation is different based on their wealth. It even helped solve the St. Petersburg paradox, the gamble with infinite expected value that people still wouldn't pay much for. Bernoulli's idea was hugely influential,
But prospect theory found a flaw in this long-standing idea.
a crucial one. Bernoulli assumed decisions are based on the final state of wealth. Kahneman and Tversky started questioning this based on experiments involving really small sums. Did it make sense that people were evaluating tiny bets based on their impact on their total lifetime wealth? Felt off.
Yeah, you don't recalculate your entire net worth before deciding whether to take a $10 bet.
Exactly. And other research suggested you should ask people directly about wealth, not just tiny changes. Then Tversky remembered an earlier idea from economist Harry Markowitz.
What was that?
Markowitz had proposed that utility might actually be attached to changes in wealth gains and losses, not absolute states. It hadn't really caught on, but for Kahneman and Tversky, it clicked.
So that was the key shift. Outcomes aren't absolute wealth levels, they're gains or losses relative to what?
Relative to a reference point. Usually that's your current situation, the status quo. This focus on changes, on gains and losses, was the fundamental departure from Bernoulli.
And the focus on expected utility had kind of hidden this possibility.
You could say that it's a bit like theory-induced blindness. The existing framework just didn't easily accommodate the idea that our reactions to gaining something versus losing the exact same thing might be fundamentally different.
So was that gain-loss difference the initial spark?
Interestingly, no. They were initially looking more at how we perceive probabilities. But then Amos Tversky just asked, what about losses? And boom, they ran some simple choice experiments.
Like what? Give us an example.
Okay, imagine this. Option A, you get $1,000 for sure. Option B, you flip a coin heads, you get $2,500. Tails, you get nothing. What do most people choose?
Hmm. Sure, $1,000 feels pretty good. I'd probably take option A, risk-averse.
Exactly. Most people are risk-averse when it comes to potential gains. Now, second scenario. You're told you're losing $1,000 for sure, option C. Or you can flip a coin heads, you lose nothing. Tails, you lose $2,500, option D.
Oof. Okay, now, losing $1,000 for sure hurts. The coin flip, maybe I avoid the loss entirely. I think I might gamble on option
And
D.
again, that's what most people do. They become risk-seeking when facing losses. They're willing to take a bigger potential loss for the chance to avoid any loss at all.
Wow. So the exact same potential outcomes relative to a starting point just framed as gains versus losses, flips or risk preference.
Precisely. This asymmetry risk aversion for gains, risk-seeking for losses, is a cornerstone of prospect theory. It couldn't be explained by traditional utility theory, which only cared about the final state of wealth.
And it all hinges on that reference point. It's not just our total wealth, but where we are now.
Absolutely. Think about those problems where they say, imagine you've been given $1,000 and then offer you a choice between a sure gain or a gamble. People often mentally reset their reference point to that $1,000.
Right. They ignore the gift and just evaluate the new options as gains or losses from that point.
Yes. It shows we're driven by the immediate prospects of winning or losing from wherever we perceive ourselves to be. And generally, the drive to avoid losses is much stronger than the drive to achieve gains.
Which leads us to the value function in prospect theory, right?
Yeah.
It looks different from Bernoulli's smooth curve.
Very different. It has three key features. First, it's defined on gains and losses relative to the reference point. Second, both the gain and loss functions show diminishing sensitivity, meaning the difference between gaining $10 and $20 feels bigger than the difference between gaining $1,010 and $1,020. Same for losses. The pain of the first $100 lost is greater than the added pain of losing the next $100.
Okay. Diminishing sensitivity, what's the third feature?
And this is crucial. The loss function is steeper than the gain function. Losing $100 feels worse than gaining $100 feels good. That's loss aversion baked right into the shape of the curve.
So losses loom larger than gains. That feels intuitively right.
It does. And this combination, loss aversion and diminishing sensitivity, explains a lot. Loss aversion makes us cautious in mixed gambles, potential gain and loss. Diminishing sensitivity, especially for losses, pushes us towards risk-seeking when all our options are bad. We gamble to avoid the bigger, almost certain loss.
This really poked holes in expected utility, didn't it? I remember reading about Rabin-Tondler's critique.
Ah, yes, the X-parrot analogy is a bit technical, but basically they show that if you explain someone rejecting a simple 50-50 bet to win $11 or lose $10 using expected utility theory, the level of risk aversion implied is astronomically high. It would mean that person should also turn down incredibly favorable large stakes bets, which just isn't realistic.
So expected utility struggled with small, everyday risks. But prospect theory isn't perfect either, is it?
No theory is perfect. One issue is the assumption that the reference point itself always has a value of 0, which can lead to some weird conclusions in certain scenarios. And importantly, neither theory initially grappled much with emotions like regret.
Ah, regret. That feeling of, I should have chosen the other option. How does that fit in?
It definitely plays a role. Knowing you could have had a sure gain, but instead gambled and lost, makes the loss feel worse. The anticipation of potential regret can absolutely steer your choice, maybe making you favor the safer option more often.
So why haven't regret-focused theories become as dominant as prospect theory?
Well, while regret is obviously real and influential, the theories built around it haven't so far offered as many unique testable predictions that clearly differentiate them from prospect theory. Prospect theory, with its concepts of the reference point and loss aversion, just explained more observable behavior more parsimoniously. It wasn't just that it felt true, it made novel, accurate predictions.
Okay, let's dig into some of those real-world consequences then. What about the endowment effect?
Right, this is a classic. Basically, we value things we own more highly than identical things we don't own. Once something is part of our endowment, letting go of it feels like a loss.
Give me an example.
Okay, say you bought a concert ticket for $50. The show sells out. Someone offers you $200. You might refuse, even if you wouldn't have dreamed of paying $200 for that ticket initially. Giving up the ticket feels like losing something valuable, more valuable than the $150 profit.
That's clearly loss aversion at work, right? The pain of losing the ticket outweighs the pleasure of gaining the extra money.
Precisely. Though it's weaker for things we hold specifically for exchange. A shopkeeper doesn't feel a loss selling inventory. That's the point. But for personal possessions, it's strong.
Wasn't there a famous experiment with mugs?
Jack Netch's experiment, yes. He gave mugs to one group, then asked how much they'd sell them for. Another group didn't get mugs but were asked how much they'd pay. A third group could choose between a mug or cash. The sellers demanded roughly twice as much as the buyers were willing to pay, and significantly more than the choosers thought the mug was worth in cash.
Wow. Just owning it doubled its perceived value for selling.
And brain imaging studies actually show selling things you feel ownership over can trigger areas linked to pain and disgust. It suggests a genuine aversion. The ratio, often around 2.1 for selling price versus buying price, lines up nicely with estimates of a loss aversion coefficient from choices involving risk.
Does this show up in markets, like how we react to price changes?
Absolutely. Price increases, which feel like a loss relative to the previous price, tend to reduce demand more significantly than equivalent price decreases boost demand. We feel the pain of paying more quite acutely.
Does experience change this, like professional traders?
Yes, experienced traders tend to show a much weaker or even absent endowment effect for the goods they trade regularly. They learn to treat them purely as commodities for exchange, overcoming that feeling of personal loss. And just having physical possession seems to strengthen the effect for non-traders. This focus on the negative isn't just about ownership, it's broader. It's called negativity bias. Our brains are wired to prioritize bad news, threats, negative stimuli.
Evolutionarily useful, I guess. Spot the danger first.
Probably. We react faster and more strongly to angry faces than happy ones, to negative words than positive ones. It keeps us alert.
And this spills into negotiations.
Hugely. Because existing terms act as a reference point, any proposed change feels like a gain for one side and a loss for the other. And since losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good, concessions feel particularly painful, making agreements difficult. Compromise is psychologically costly.
Even ideas about fairness seem tied to this reference point.
Definitely. If a company raises prices drastically during an emergency, even if justified by supply and demand, people perceive it as unfair because it deviates so sharply from the reference price. They feel like they're losing out, being taken advantage of, and might punish the company later.
Okay, let's shift back to probabilities. You mentioned we don't weigh them linearly.
Right. Prospect theory highlights how changes near the endpoints from impossibility, 0% to possibility, and from possibility to certainty, 100%, have a much bigger psychological impact than changes in the middle.
That's the possibility effect and the certainty effect.
Exactly. The possibility effect means we overweight low probabilities.
Yeah.
That tiny chance of winning the lottery, going from 0% to, say, 0.0001%, feels disproportionately significant, driving ticket sales.
And the certainty effect.
That's where we underweight outcomes that are almost certain compared to outcomes that are truly certain. A 99% chance of winning feels much less secure than a 100% chance. We'll often pay a premium for that absolute certainty. Think about settling a lawsuit. You might accept the lower sure amount rather than face even a tiny chance of getting nothing, even if the expected value of going to court is higher.
This flies in the face of traditional rational choice theory, like von Neumann and Morgenstern's axioms.
It does. Their theory says rational actors should weigh outcomes by their probabilities linearly. Violating this, like in the famous LA paradox where people flip preferences to achieve certainty, leads to logical inconsistencies from their perspective.
But prospect theory isn't saying people should be this way, just that they are.
Precisely. It incorporates these psychological realities, like nonlinear decision weights, to describe how choices are actually made, irrational or not, by classical standards.
This leads to that fourfold pattern of risk attitudes, right? Can you break that down?
Sure, it combines probability level, high versus low, with outcome type, gain versus loss.
Okay. Low probability gains.
Risk-seeking. Think lottery tickets. The small possibility of a large gain is overweighted. Possibility effect. Hope drives this.
High probability gains.
Risk-averse. Think accepting a sure thing over a slightly better gamble. We underweight the high probability and crave certainty. Certainty effect. Fear of disappointment.
Low probability losses.
Risk averse. Think buying insurance. We overweight the small chance of a large loss and want to eliminate it. Possibility effect. Fear of disaster.
And high probability losses.
Risk seeking. Think the defendant in a lawsuit facing near certain defeat. They might gamble on the small chance of winning a trial to avoid the near certain loss. Certainty effect. Hope for a miracle or just desperation.
That pattern seems to cover a lot of ground. You can see it playing out in situations like litigation. The plaintiff might settle low, the defendant might roll the dice.
Exactly. But consistently acting according to this pattern, deviating from expected value, can be costly over time. Overpaying for insurance, buying too many lottery tickets, rejecting favorable settlements. But adds up.
What about really rare events like terrorism or natural disasters?
We tend to overestimate their probability, especially if they're vivid and easily recalled. That's the availability heuristic again, often amplified by media coverage into an availability cascade. And the possibility effect means we overweight the impact of that small probability.
And how it's described matters too.
Yes, denominator neglect. Saying one person in the 100,000 gets sick sounds more alarming and weighs more heavily than saying the probability is 0.0001%, even though they're identical. The frequency makes the individual case more salient.
Is this overweighting of rare events always true?
Interestingly, research suggests it's more pronounced when we learn about risks from description, like reading statistics, than when we learn from experience. If you repeatedly encounter a situation with a rare outcome and it doesn't happen, you might actually start to underweight it.
Okay, this idea of how things are presented brings us squarely to framing.
Absolutely crucial. Narrow framing versus broad framing is a key distinction.
Narrow framing is looking at each decision on its own.
Yes. And broad framing is looking at it as part of a portfolio of decisions. Think about a simple, favorable gamble, say 50-50 to win $150 or lose $100.
Viewed narrowly, that $100 loss might loom large due to loss aversion, so I might reject it.
Right. But if you adopt a broad frame and imagine making that same bet every day for a year, the potential loss on any single day becomes less significant compared to the high probability of a substantial overall gain.
That's like Samuelson's colleague who wouldn't take the single bet but would happily take 100 of them.
Exactly. It highlights the irrationality of narrow framing when dealing with repeated favorable risks. The advice is often to think like a trader, view each small risk as one of many, blunting the emotional sting of individual losses.
Kahneman talks about using a risk policy or taking the outside view as tools here.
Yes, these are ways to enforce broad framing. A risk policy means treating recurring small risks similarly, based on long-run expected value. The outside view means looking at the statistics of similar situations rather than focusing on the specifics of the current one. Both help counter loss aversion and overconfidence.
We see the cost of narrow framing in investing too, like the disposition effect.
Classic example, selling winners too soon to lock in a sure gain driven by risk aversion in the gain domain, and holding losers too long, hoping to avoid realizing a loss, driven by risk-seeking in the loss domain. It comes directly from prospect theory's value function.
And it's related to the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad.
Very related. The past investment is gone, irrelevant to the future prospects. But realizing the loss by abandoning the project is psychologically painful, so we might irrationally continue, driven by the hope of breaking even risk-seeking in the loss domain again.
Regret also pops up again here, pushing us towards safer, conventional choices.
Definitely. Choosing an unconventional option that fails leads to more potential regret and blame than choosing a standard option that fails. So we often play it safe, even if the unconventional path might have a higher expected value.
And feeling responsible makes loss aversion even stronger.
Yes, the potential loss feels heavier if we know we'll be held accountable for it. It makes us even more cautious.
Then there's mental accounting, treating money differently depending on where it came from or what it's for.
Right, like being more willing to splurge with windfall money than with earned money. Even though logically, money is fungible, it's another form of framing that leads to inconsistent choices.
And preference reversals where our choices change depending on how options are evaluated.
Yes, evaluating options one at a time, single evaluation, can lead us to focus on easily comparable features, while seeing them side by side, joint evaluation, allows for a more direct comparison of the important attributes.
Like the crime victim compensation example, or C's music dictionary study.
Exactly. The dictionary with more entries but a torn cover might look bad on its own, but when compared to a pristine dictionary with fewer entries, its superiority becomes clear. Joint evaluation highlights the more important dimension, number of entries. that's harder to assess in isolation.
So evaluation mode is another powerful framing effect.
It really is, and framing in general is just incredibly powerful. How you phrase the exact same choice can completely flip the decision.
Like asking people if they want to pay $5 for a 10% chance to win $100 versus offering them a 10% chance to win $95 or lose $5.
The first sounds like buying a lottery ticket, a cost, not a loss. The second highlights the potential loss, making it less attractive, even though they're identical financially. Costs are not losses is a powerful psychological frame.
Or the keep 20 pounds versus lose 30 pounds framing. People work harder to avoid the loss.
Yes, and medical decisions. 90% survival rate sounds much better than 10% mortality rate. Same outcome, different frame, different emotional response.
The Asian disease problem is the classic illustration, isn't it?
It is. Framing the options in terms of lives saved makes people risk-averse, choosing the sure thing. Framing the exact same outcomes in terms of lives lost makes people risk-seeking, choosing the gamble. It perfectly demonstrates prospect theory's core tenets.
Even seemingly neutral things, like tax exemptions, can be framed to influence perceived fairness.
Right. Is removing an exemption taking something away, a loss, or just failing to provide a bonus, not a gain? Schelling's example shows how the default frame shapes perception.
And finally, the MPG illusion, a really practical example of a bad frame.
Yes, focusing on miles per gallon is misleading because the relationship between MPG and fuel consumption is nonlinear. Switching from 10 to 20 MPG saves way more fuel than switching from 40 to 50 MPG. Reframing it in gallons per 100 miles makes the actual fuel savings much clearer and leads to more rational choices about efficiency upgrades.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, we've really seen how prospect theory opened up our understanding of decision-making. It wasn't just minor tweaks, it highlighted these fundamental psychological forces.
Absolutely. The reference point, loss aversion, diminishing sensitivity, the way we perceive probabilities, these aren't just quirks. They are core components of how we choose, often pulling us away from the purely rational path described by older economic models.
And we touched on so many related biases and effects, endowment, certainty and possibility effects, sunk costs, and the huge impact of framing.
And hopefully for you listening, this exploration has given you a clearer lens to view your own decision processes, those aha moments about why you might feel or choose a certain way without, we hope, feeling overwhelmed by the theory.
So here's something to think about. Consider the last significant decision you made. What was your reference point going in? How strongly did potential losses weigh on you compared to potential gains? And looking back, can you see how the way the options were presented, the frame, might have nudged you one way or another?
Just recognizing these factors, loss aversion, the power of the status quo, the framing, is such a crucial first step towards making perhaps more deliberate and effective choices going forward.
There's so much more fascinating research that has spun out from these initial insights. It's a really rich field.
It truly is. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these ideas and just notice them playing out in your own life, in the news, in business. It's everywhere once you start looking.